You're listening to On Reflection, the beauty podcast with a global view on beauty, hosted by me, Funmi Fetto. Today's show is brought to you by our brand partner, Paula's Choice, the scientifically proven, non-irritating, multifaceted, gimmick-free skincare brand. Later in the show, I'll be speaking with Nina Davaluri, who's an acclaimed activist, filmmaker, actor, entrepreneur, and former Miss America. She's set out to redefine beauty standards by spearheading a campaign against colorism. But first, Required Reading, where we discuss beauty news, topics, and features that have caught our attention. Joining me is Jessica Schiffer, a contributing editor at Vogue Business, who also writes for numerous publications, including the New York Times, InStyle, and the Business of Fashion. Jessica, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I don't know if it's just me, but I found this week's stories actually quite emotional. They all totally resonated with me. I'd love us to start with a piece in British Vogue by Georgia Day, who's a brilliant beauty writer who's also actually a friend. And the feature is entitled, "This is Why You Should Celebrate Your Spots." And it's basically around the acne positive movement. It was inspired by a post that the model and activist Adwoa Aboah shared showing her breakouts. But interestingly, rather than people focusing on her blemishes and her spots, they were more interested in her ear piercings, perhaps highlighting that the stigma around acne and perfect skin may have begun to shift. I thought it was interesting. It looks like we're beginning to normalize it, although I do think there's two sides of the coin. What were your thoughts around this piece?
I would agree with you there. I think I was pleasantly surprised because we do live in a world of social media where everyone is filtering their faces to the nth degree and trying to look as perfect as possible. But like you said, there are two sides of the coin. And I think the other side is this acne positivity movement that has sort of taken off in the last few years, especially driven by Gen Z, who I think are much more open about this stuff than previous generations. And I think people are starting to realize that the shame that has, for so long been associated with acne and not having perfect skin, whatever that might mean, is ridiculous. And we all have skin issues. They may be on a spectrum, but we all deal with these things. None of us wake up with perfect skin, and there shouldn't be any negativity around it. It doesn't mean anything about us as people. And so I think it's really refreshing to see that somebody with such a big following is being celebrated for that, and people aren't really commenting on it negatively, but instead focusing on her beautiful earrings, and it's just not really a big deal that she has a few spots.
It was just refreshing to see, as you say, because for me, you come across a lot of famous faces, a lot of celebrities, and if you're doing beauty interviews with them or you're talking to them about their skincare regime and how they get their skin looking so great, they'll say things like, "Oh, I drink lots of water and I eat lots of greens." And it's so annoying. I can't even bear to hear it anymore. And it's also, I find it so insincere because, of course, there are a lot of things that enable people to have good skin. And a lot of that's down to genetics. And when I say good skin, I put that in inverted commas because I think that is subjective and it means different things to different people. But when you connect good skin with lifestyle choices that other people make or don't make, what you're trying to say in many ways, maybe inadvertently, is that the reason you haven't got good skin is your fault. You are making choices that ensure that you don't have good skin. And so people who are breaking out and don't have that pore-free glass skin are then made to feel really ashamed and at fault for not having this skin that adheres to these ridiculous standards that, to be frank, most people just cannot meet.
Totally. And the drinking water thing is so absurd. I read that everywhere. And, I drink water every day too. I still get cystic acne on my chin. You can't change things like that just based on lifestyle choices. I agree with you that a lot of it is genetic, but it's also about wealth and what you can afford, what kind of treatments you can afford, which many celebrities have access to that most people do not. And so I just don't think you can really make the comparison between yourself and someone with a huge following, whether they're an influencer or a celebrity.
That is a really good point. However, it does go to show that skin issues are indiscriminate because, Kiki Palmer, she recently posted a completely makeup free shot of her, and you could see how extreme her acne and hyperpigmentation was. And she said she had done absolutely everything to deal with her acne. She had gone to lots of different doctors. She's done all the things that she was supposed to do, been on different steroids and so on. And it's only when she looked into her family background that she realized that she had polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's something that had been attacking her all her life, but she had no idea. So there is definitely that side of things as well. People who have a lot of money have access to dermatologists and doctors and so on, but you do have instances where even that doesn't afford you so-called good skin. But also, I don't think the industry really help. There's so many pressures when you have big beauty brands who have a lot of clout and could use their clout to change beauty standards or ideals of standards. And yet, the word flawless, for instance, is used to market so many products from skincare to makeup. And we still see a lot of faces that are filtered to the point of being completely pore free. That pressure to be perfect is just there. It's like everywhere.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a sea change amongst newer independent brands in terms of the language they're using and the way in which they are celebrating quote unquote flaws. But I do think the bigger beauty conglomerates still have a huge way to go in terms of making progress on how they are talking about women and men, not just their skin, but their hair, their bodies. I mean, there are so many ways that they speak about people that I think make the customer feel ashamed that I think really still need to be worked on.
And in so many cultures, the texture and the look of your skin is so closely connected to how you are treated and how you are valued. Some people will look at your skin conditions and breakouts and the texture of your skin, and they'll associate them with your level of hygiene, which is so awful. And, so many of these things, they have such a significant impact on your mental health and sense of self. So, it is pretty serious. I love that you have bloggers like Ford and Lou Northcote, and even, Winnie Harlow, who owns her vitiligo and doesn't cover it up. All of these people are instrumental in normalizing the conversation around skin, actual, real, proper skin, real life skin, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are starting to see more and more people who do have the power and influence that maybe the average person doesn't speak out about their own experiences and their various different skin conditions. And I think that goes a long way in making the customer out there feel less shame in whatever they're dealing with and make them realize that it is totally normal. There's nothing wrong with them and it's okay.
Absolutely. So now the second story, I loved this story so much. This is from Allure by Tanya Russell, and it's called The Beauty Standards We Inherit, or How Beauty Standards Pass Through Generations. I think it's one of the best beauty pieces I've read in a while. Essentially, it's about the trauma that has been caused by unreasonable beauty standards in our families. I think it's something that a lot of people will relate to. I mean, at one point, it actually made me cry. I thought it was just really powerful, and it's not something I've really read about in that way,
I think it felt very personal to me as well. I don't know a woman in the world who would not be able to relate to it. I think we all have some form of aesthetic trauma, as they call it, which was a term I had never heard of before. It essentially refers to this idea or concept of our families making us feel shame around something relating to the way that we look. And I think it extends beyond our families as well to society at large, whether it's an advertisement or just friends of ours, other family members who are just making us feel like something about the way we look is inadequate. And that's something I've definitely felt throughout my life. I've had an eating disorder. I felt like my body was too large and I felt like I needed to, starve myself in order to fit a certain mold. So I understand what it feels like to just not feel accepted in your natural form. And a lot of that started with judgment from family members. And that's what this piece touches on, where you have these people in your life who are supposed to be the closest people to you, the people who love you the most. And sometimes they can say things or do things that really make you feel terrible about yourself. And I think what the piece did that I thought was so interesting was they dive into how you can work through that and how you can still move forward with your life and have a healthy sense of self and a healthy relationship to your body.
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful piece. I mean, the psychologist in the piece, she's based in Washington, D.C. She's the one who coined that term aesthetic trauma. And like you, yeah, I'd never heard of that either. And I thought it was really interesting. The writer herself writes about how when she stopped blow drying her hair, and she's a Black woman, she said when she stopped blow drying her hair, her grandmother asked why she would intentionally make herself look ugly. You know, it's that kind of thing where, as you say, these are people who are the nearest and dearest to you. They're people who love you, and they don't realize the seeds they're planting when they speak those things over you. The impact it has way into your adult years on how you see yourself. I think it's wonderful that this psychologist has a safe space that can consistently value women. She was saying that it is challenging to find a support system that consistently values Black beauty. But we know, like you were saying, you know, this is not something that's just limited to Black women. It also talks about the part that men play in this. One model, Natasha Ward, talked about how her father's comments affected her. And now, because of the way she's been able to work through all of that, she said, I've overcome the desire to shrink around men in order to make them feel more masculine and in order to make myself more palatable. And I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I think what's really hard with this kind of issue is that it's so rooted in our culture, and unraveling that and unpacking it is going to take so much time. But I think this is such a good start in being more and more open about the fact that we all deal with these kinds of comments. And by all, I mean mostly women, although I do think men deal with it as well. Women being more comfortable with having these conversations is so important because there is shame around admitting you're insecure about something, which is sort of ironic because we're so constantly made to feel like we should be insecure about something, and yet we're not supposed to open up about it. And I think the more that women can talk to each other about these insecurities or this sense of lacking something that maybe is passed down to them by a family member, the more we can be open about that, the better suited we will be to overcome whatever feelings of inadequacy we carry.
You're right. And the writer herself makes the point that it is a lifelong battle because society affirms and perpetuates this beauty oppression in many ways. So it is a constant fight. Let's go on to our third and final piece, which is from Fast Company. I love Fast Company. They have such brilliant pieces. I'd love you to break down what this piece is about and why you chose it.
Yeah, for sure. The brand dives into the response we saw after the George Floyd protests this summer from beauty brands. And, you know, it wasn't just beauty brands, it was really every brand across the market that suddenly felt this urge to become inclusive and diverse. And I think it was very obvious that this was happening. And in a lot of cases, it was pretty disingenuous. I follow a lot of Black influencers who were calling these brands out and kind of pointing out that they had not shown people of color in general on their Instagram feeds, on their websites, and their product imagery up until that point around June. And so it made the efforts feel a bit hollow, you could say. And I think this was especially true in the beauty industry. But yet there was still hope that maybe this would be a long-term change. So the article dives into the sad reality that it wasn't really as long-term as many of us had hoped. There had been a spike, I think it was 122% in images of people of color, particularly Black people, in beauty brands imagery. And that already has decreased significantly. And it's only been a few months. And so it just goes to show that this superficial change that a lot of brands were making where, okay, we'll change our marketing imagery for a few months is really not enough. The article dives into the fact that there just are not enough Black women and men in these boardrooms in management who If there were, I think this wouldn't be such a problem because they would be able to call this out in a way that I think a lot of white people, sadly, have not been able to up until this point.
I completely agree with you. You know, the sad truth is that none of this surprised me at all. I wanted to be completely optimistic that things have completely changed and we had a complete sea change and we were going to see this as a permanent change. But, you know, I hate to say it, but I think a lot of Black people knew that it's going to take a while. I knew that this would not be something of permanence. I mean, I would have thought that these brands who posted the black box during the times of protest and made all of these declarations and gave money and did all of these things, you know, I knew that this was all about optics and a lot of it was performative. But I never at any point thought that this would be continuous. I've been in the industry like yourself, you know, for so long. And I know that there are a lot of them that are not really engaged with diversity and the issues around inclusivity and race. So this was always going to be the case. You know, rather than trying to change beauty standards, they do everything to validate them. I've worked with brands who post certain things on their Instagram feed and immediately they see that they're not getting the likes because, you know, it's a dark-skinned girl who has afro hair that doesn't look very anglicized, or it's not those biracial curls. And then they see that, oh, we're not getting as many likes, and they stop doing it. I've seen that over and over and over again. They'll say things like, oh, well, it didn't quite perform. But I always say that as brands, you have a platform and you have a power to be able to change the way the beauty industry is going, the direction they're going in. And I think you made a really good point that it will only change when the inside, when behind the scenes change, you know, the boardroom and those people who are in positions of authority, those people making decisions. That's what needs to change in order for us to see the change, you know, at the consumer end of things.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that brands will tell you the posts with Black women or men do not perform as well, because I just don't buy that. I mean, there is so much Black spending power. So that excuse to me rings very hollow. And I think it's BS, to put it lightly. So it is crazy to me that brands and executives are still using that kind of excuse to fall back on when they aren't being as diverse as they should be. Even if it were true, and let's say a post wasn't getting as much engagement or something like that, I believe that brands need to take a stand on these issues. Customers today want brands who have certain values that they really stand by and are true to, and those values need to be in alignment with the consumer. And I think most consumers today, especially young consumers, want to shop from brands who are anti-racist and are celebrating inclusivity. So it shouldn't really matter what the engagement on a post on Instagram is. It should matter that you are celebrating all different types of people.
Absolutely. I think we need to move the needle so much more in terms of what we uphold as beauty. Like you say, I think it's a lot of the new Gen Z driven brands, the millennial brands, they are doing some great things in terms of really shifting our perspective on what beauty is and what beauty looks like and who has a right to be within that space. A lot of the establishment brands or the so-called prestige or luxury brands, I think there's still a way to go there. They're used to churning out the same old images and working with the same group of people. One of the points the piece made was that a lot of these brands utilize influencers and their influencers aren't very diverse. If your influencers aren't diverse and their followers aren't diverse, you have the same issue. Nothing ever changes. And basically they need to work a little bit more with influencers of color to ensure that they really strike the right balance.
Yeah. And I don't think it should rest on the influencer's shoulders to make sure that a brand is acting in a truly authentically diverse way. But I do think hiring more diverse influencers is a good start. More importantly, I think you also need to hire people behind the scenes who understand what, say, a Black audience wants to see from you.
As I said to someone recently, if you are in a position to hire and you look around the room and everybody looks like you, something is very, very wrong. That is, for me, the biggest thing that needs to change in the beauty industry. I think once that starts to change, then we'll see a lot more change.
Absolutely.
Jessica, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This was fun.
And now, in praise of, where we laud the merits of a single beauty product. This week, it's Paula's Choice Defense Hydrating Gel to Cream Cleanser. I've spoken quite extensively about my strong belief that a cleanser should at the very least clean your face. You'd think it'd be obvious, right? But no, a cleanser that properly cleaned was actually quite a rare thing. These days, not so much. However, as we are now battling a lot of modern day situations that have a detrimental effect on how our skin looks and behaves, our cleansers have had to up their game. One of skin's biggest enemies is pollution. Smog, car fumes, blue light from digital devices, general toxins in the air. Yeah, all fun and games. Not. So if you're wondering why, despite all your efforts, your skin still looks dull, blotchy, and discolored, it's probably down to pollution. Pollution accelerates your aging process. Yeah, I know. Yikes. So that's the bad news. The good news is Paula's Choice Defense range of products includes an anti-pollution complex to combat this. I particularly love the cleanser. It combines green tea, licorice, and soy to neutralize surface pollutants. The gel to cream texture leaves your skin feeling hydrated, and it cleans, like properly cleans, without stripping your skin. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people would argue that you could just move to the countryside where the air is fresher and is cleaner. But here's a fact for you. Pollution is everywhere. Sorry. So just get a cleanser to deal with it. It's cheaper than moving house. Now, talking points. My very special guest today is Nina Davoluri. She's an acclaimed activist, a filmmaker, an actor, and an entrepreneur. She first gained international recognition as Miss America 2014. Her most recent venture, however, is all about disrupting global beauty standards. She's produced a new documentary, #Complexion, which addresses the issue of colorism around the world. Nina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. It's such an honor to have you. So we're going to talk about the incredible documentary that you've created on the topic of colorism. We'll talk about that in a moment. However, I would like to go back a little. So you are now a global leader in redefining beauty standards. You also hosted and produced a reality show, Made in America, to help young girls and young women break their own perceptions of beauty and stereotypes. You were incredibly invited by Michelle Obama to collaborate on a number of initiatives, and you do so much work advocating for gender equality. How you really came to the world's attention, however, was by becoming the first Indian American and South Asian to win the Miss America title, which is incredible in and of itself. However, beauty pageants are generally criticized not just as anti-feminist, but also for upholding patriarchal ideals of beauty, many of which you're fighting against now. So tell me, what led you down the road of beauty pageants?
You know, it's an interesting time, I think, from when I was introduced to the beauty pageant space and to the time that we're in now. So I actually started competing in the Miss America organization, which is the longest running competition in the history of the United States. I actually started competing for scholarship money. My parents were generous enough to offer to pay for a portion of my education, but I knew that I had to fund another significant portion of that. So one of my friends actually introduced me to the Miss America program. And she said, you know, you're very involved in your community. Every contestant who competes within the organization is required to have a personal platform, a cause that they choose to champion for their year of service, is what we call it. It was a great way to earn scholarship money to pay for my tuition. And every contestant also required a talent. So I grew up a dancer, a classically trained Bharatanatyam dancer, which is a classical form of Indian dance. And so I loved performing. I still do. And so this just seemed like a really unique way to continue to stay involved in all the activities I was interested in and have a platform and voice within my community. And so through my time competing, I earned over $90,000 in scholarship money specifically, graduated debt-free from the University of Michigan, and able to put money towards my master's degree. So it was a unique way to certainly pay for education. But of course, winning a title like Miss America it just opens doors in many different directions that I would have never thought possible before.
So how did colorism become your main focus? I mean, was activism always part of the plan?
It was. I didn't just wake up as Miss America and decide to promote diversity one day. It has been something I've been actively doing essentially my entire life, but officially with my platform, which was celebrating diversity through cultural competency over now the past 10 years. And so for me, bringing awareness, growing up in a culture that oftentimes I felt misunderstood, there were a lot of stereotypes about the South Asian culture in my background, that correcting those stereotypes was a huge part of the work that I had done and am continuing to do as well. With colorism, that sort of took on a separate but also equally important conversation because it is certainly a part of, everything I had experienced growing up. I remember the morning after I'd won Miss America, I woke up to a headline in an Indian newspaper that read, "Is Miss America too dark to be Miss India?" And I just remember thinking, wow, enough is enough. And a flood of insecurities for a brief moment came back to me from the time that I was young. Growing up in a South Asian household, you hear comments like, "Don't go out in the sun, you're going to get too dark," or, "Oh, you'd be so much more beautiful if you were a few shades lighter." Growing up, going back and forth, visiting my family in India, you see ads for fairness creams. You're berated by media images from Bollywood to magazines. It's just something you're constantly surrounded by. And so to finally have a platform to win something so iconic as Miss America that in the past was a competition for only white females, and to have that representation, to have the conversation almost be surrounded by this negative cloud of colorism was something that I knew that I had to address. And there were millions of girls around the world feeling this way, that because they were dark-skinned, that they're not worthy, that they're not considered elite or beautiful, successful, etc. And so really unpacking what this idea meant across cultures around the world was, I guess, the impetus behind all of it.
I love the fact that you traveled around the world for this documentary, for people to see that colorism is actually a global issue. One of the things that I saw that I was quite saddened about, where you were speaking to a lady in Ghana who recounted a story of a little girl violently scrubbing her own skin because she wanted to be white. And I found that so heartbreaking. Talk to me about some of the other stories across different cultures and countries and continents that you uncovered.
Yeah, this was something that, when you set out to produce a documentary, I think everyone hopes and prays that they uncover the truth. And that was the intention that I set as we started filming, because you never know. You never know what people are going to feel comfortable sharing. There's so many factors that go into the process. And do they trust you? Can they feel comfortable with you? And you're essentially asking for people to share some of their deepest insecurities. And that's a really difficult place. But what I've always said is being vulnerable is an incredibly difficult place, but it's also a really powerful place. And I realized that as I shared my story with them or with others, people felt comfortable and safe being able to share their own. That wasn't within 5 minutes, of course. This was multiple weeks of filming. But, a couple that really stood out to me, I think India was, of course, very close to home. Especially there was a story of two young girls, two best friends. One of them was much darker skinned and her friend was really light skinned. And her darker skinned friend wanted to become a model. And she had been bullied in school because of her skin color. She was almost suicidal because of this. I think that is a particular story that unfortunately is incredibly common within India. And for people to actually see it and recognize it and know that it's happening, I think opened a really very real, powerful conversation that I hope is continuing now. I remember the other that stands out immediately. We were filming in Italy, and there was a gentleman, his name was Matteo, and he said he's a white male, and from all intensive purposes looks like the ideal, or what people would consider. And his story was that he always wanted to be Black his entire life. And I remember asking him the question, well, have you ever thought about what it actually is to be living as a Black man walking in their shoes? Have you thought for a second what that is truly like? And I don't think he did. And so these were just really interesting human stories that I hope that when people see them, they pause, or they think, or they see themselves represented in this. And, we can continue to have a more open dialogue about it.
Yes, I saw that interview that you did with Matteo, and I was fascinated by that. I think it was interesting you asking him that question as to whether he really truly understands what it is to walk in the shoes of a Black man, because his experiences in life would be so completely different.
Yeah, I mean, the term white privilege is the huge discussion that's happening now and has been happening for years and years. But that was actually a term that he had not heard of or even recognized until I had mentioned it to him. And so to see him almost process this himself and think, wait, I really, whether that's opportunities, careers, how you're treated, I think it was the first time he was also thinking or realizing that.
You touched on the vulnerability of a lot of your interviewees and the people that you met, and they had to show themselves as vulnerable to be able to tell their stories. One of the clips that I saw with you were also being quite vulnerable, talking about this relationship that you had with someone who didn't want to introduce you to his mother, even though you'd been dating for a while, because he felt his mother would think you were too dark. I'd love you to talk about that situation.
Yeah, this one was hard. I remember sharing this story in the context of I was actually speaking with a group of 20 to 30-year-olds. So I felt very comfortable amongst them. And I remember starting this conversation and asking them about dating and marriage and how skin color affects their partner, affects who they're attracted to, what they're looking for. And no one spoke up. It was just like 30 seconds of uncomfortable, awkward silence. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, like I have to say something. Like if I'm going to ask them to share, I need to be able to share with them. And so I told them an experience that I had had. And I was in college and I had been dating my boyfriend at the time for almost 2 years now. And we were both South Asian American, I should say. So we kind of had a toe between both cultures. And the time had come for us to meet each other's parents, and we were having that conversation. And I remember asking him, oh, if your parents meet me, what will they think of me? Will they like me? And I remember him saying, if my mother meets you, she's probably going to think that you're too dark. And that was really hard to hear. As I looked back on it, hindsight really is 2020. But I remember realizing that actually you think that and you're projecting that because your mother hadn't met me at this point. You don't know if she really thinks that or is going to say that. But a part of you, because of the culture that we grew up in, you're still carrying that ideology forward, and you still associate this idea of fair skin with beautiful or acceptance. And to me, that was the most hurtful thing.
And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? A lot of us who come from cultures where colorism is so prevalent, myself as a British-born African, I mean, there are so many issues with skin color within the Nigerian community, within the African community, within the Black community. So there are a lot of things that you have touched on in your projects that really resonate. What's interesting, you saying that your ex-boyfriend was actually projecting what he really thinks onto his mother. And we have this idea sometimes, and I think it's an erroneous idea, that the issues of colorism are really something linked to the older generation, and that the younger generation thinks about these things in a different way. But that's not so true, is it? We're finding that a lot of young people are still perpetuating those ideas and those ideals of what beauty looks like because of what we've been fed by society or by our traditions and our culture.
Oh, absolutely. This is the first generation, our generation, where we're recognizing that colorism is an issue. It is a form of racism, and we're really speaking out against it and stopping to ask the question, well, why? Why was I told this my entire life? Even little things like just hearing it constantly growing up in our houses, in our homes, like, oh, that color makes you look dark. This other color will make your skin look lighter. And it's all of these little things along the way, or even little comments like, oh, she would be prettier if she were lighter skinned. When you hear those things reinforced constantly, and that's what you grow up around and it's what you see, you just start believing it. And so this is the first time that I think that our society has really stepped up and starting to speak against it, speak out about it. I hope that this mentality ends with our generation. I'm hopeful because of everything that I've seen and having multiple conversations globally. This is something that I certainly don't want to pass down to my kids. I see comments from other people who are raising children now who have had to tell their parents, if you make comments like these in front of my children, I just don't want you visiting them. These are not ideals and values that I want my children to grow up with. And so I hope that this is the end of it with our generation.
I do hope so. I mean, I think colorism being dismantled, I mean, it's such a huge mountain to overcome in many ways. I think because there's so much of culture and systems and traditions and attitudes of different generations that influence it. So I'm guessing our approach in terms of how we overcome it and how we destroy it has to be a multi-pronged approach, because I think the messaging around colorism for someone who is in their 50s and lives in Nigeria, where, being lighter skin gives you access to certain opportunities, and speaking to them and then speaking to someone who maybe is living on the Western side of the world and is much younger and maybe works in fashion or whatever, they have a completely different perspective. So I'm thinking that in terms of the tools we use to be able to combat this, I'm not sure if one size will fit all.
I absolutely agree. And I think it really truly starts in our own homes between generations. And I think one of the most meaningful moments that I've had in my own journey was watching this mindset shift within my family members, which frankly, I wasn't sure would happen. I think by them hearing me share my story, my struggles, how it made me felt, they definitely stopped to think, oh, well, why did we say those things? Or why did we believe that that was the only form of or standard of beauty? And I grew up in a house where my mom and her sister, my mom is very dark skinned in comparison to her sister, who is much lighter skinned. And growing up from a young age, seeing my aunt and mother, it was just always in our house of, oh, my mom's name is Sheila. Sheila's really dark, but she has nice features, but her older sister is so fair and so beautiful. And just hearing things like that. I'm very close with my aunt. And this time when I was filming in India, I remember going to visit her after the month of filming the documentary this past January. And she was catching up with a friend, as everyone does, and having tea. And I remember them talking about one of their friends who was getting married, or whose daughter was getting married. And my aunt's friend had made the comment, oh, yeah, the bride isn't that fair. She's a little dark. And, of course, I had a mouthful to say in that moment, kindly, but it was actually my aunt who spoke up first. And she said, we can't make comments like that anymore. With everything that Nina's been working on, she's sensitive to it. And I was like, you know what, if I have to be sensitive to these comments, great. Like, if that helps, at least maybe next time my aunt's friend won't say that again, in front of anyone. Sometimes people will say to me, oh, well, people are just set in their ways. Like, my grandmother won't change. My parents won't change. I think it's our obligation to at least try. And it's not just one conversation. It's multiple conversations over time and years. And I've seen that happen in my family.
That's such a beautiful story. And it's amazing how the work you've been doing is having an impact, not just across the world, but in your own home and in your own family, because then it becomes really, really personal and even more powerful in many ways. Thank you so much, Nina, for joining me today. Thank you for the incredible work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to continue the conversation and hopeful with ones such as these. So thank you for sharing it.
And that's it for this week. Please do visit us on orbpodcast.com for links to all the articles we discussed. And if you haven't already done so, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter. My thanks to Jessica Schiffer, Nina Davaluri, this week's brand partner Paula's Choice, and to you for listening to On Reflection. On Reflection is a Battersea Podcast production.